afternoon. Welcome to the first ASC seminar of 2024. I'm really honored to be kicking this off. And it's also a great pleasure to introduce Sandra Calkins to you. Sandra and I met about 5 years ago. I was doing fieldwork in Kisumu. She was working in Uganda. So when she was traveling back to Nairobi, she visited me there. And we've had many meetings since. And then earlier or last year, actually, she moved to Twente University to become Associate Professor of Environment, Technology, and Decolonial Knowledge there. So when I heard she was going to be in the Netherlands, I told her she should definitely come and do a seminar here. I really appreciate how she brings together the study of science in Africa and a multi-species perspective. And I think she'll also be telling us about that today. So Sandra, the floor is yours. Thanks so much.
Such a nice personal introduction, and also thanks so much for having me here. Now in Twente Technical University, I'm really delighted to be in a room again with a bunch of Africanists and anthropologists, historians, so this is a real delight for me. Let me see. Share screen. Here. Okay, perfect. So I am presenting today work in progress from a manuscript about banana cultivation, human-plant relationships, and science in Uganda, or post-colonial science. And the title that I selected for my presentations, this Plotting Human-Plant Futures, is inspired very much by the Jamaican decolonial scholar Sylvia Wynter, and particularly her discussion of plots in an essay that is called A Novel and History, Plot and Plantation. Some of you might know that. So it's actually in this, it doesn't come out very well, but that's just the reference. So in this essay, Wynter really draws attention to what she said, the historically corresponding rise of the plantation and of another form, namely the novel. And she said like the rise of capitalism and of the market economy unfolded on the backs of enslaved African plantation workers in the Caribbean. So they were growing crops for faraway markets. But she shows that they also always received small plots to grow their own food. And so the point here is that she shows that it's from these plots that they were able then to grow their own bodies, growing food, that they grew their own bodies. But for her, it's also important to say also it enabled something else, namely metaphorically growing. So this was something, plots also enabled growing hope. And here she says, growing other narrative plot lines. So for me, Wynter's discussion of plots draws attention to the ways in which the literal growth of plants in a place entwines with imaginations of growing or building, lives or other futures. So plots here become many things. Spaces mapped out by colonizers, and at the same time, spaces of decolonial anti-capitalist resistance, physical agricultural spaces and metaphors. And although Wynter doesn't go so much into that in this piece, spaces where the human is made and remade alongside a multitude of other beings and entities. And so I take inspiration from this to think from mundane and humble plots, from the concrete places where people grow plants, grow their bodies, their dreams, imaginations, and futures. And I'm kind of interested in what happens in such plots between humans and plants. Kind of what forms of intimacy emerge here? So be these plots conventional gardens, or be they rather scientific plantings? So in my view, thinking from such plots is valuable because it also enables us to kind of counter rather top-down heroic histories and narrations. And these often leave the activities of everyday actors out of the pictures. Farmers rarely figure in these, but they also leave the roles of non-human protagonists out of the picture. Now for plants, this is quite remarkable. Though plants are indispensable for human survival, their contributions to human existence and history are quite underappreciated. And people relate to plants in quotidian, humble, and vastly unacknowledged ways. So to be plotting with plants highlights codependencies and intimacies between human and plants that still rarely receive much attention. So I have been thinking in my own fieldwork in Uganda what it means to share physical spaces with plants, be around them, work with and on them, and especially in the course of my fieldwork in a scientific research project on banana plants, my thinking occurred especially in response to that, but also in response to recent scholarship in critical plant studies. I think this might be a field you might not be familiar with, or maybe you are, I don't know, and multi-species anthropology. So thinking from a number of scenes during my field work with Ugandan, mainly Ugandan, but also to some extent Australian plant biologists, I want to ask what is actually at people's fingertips when they touch plants? So what longer histories and archives does a skilled hand tap? And are there forms of knowledge that are embodied, that are maybe not made explicit, but still sensed and felt when people deal with plants? And would thinking from what happens in such spaces of physical proximity allow narrating other plot lines in the sense of winter? So what does it actually mean to be intimate with plants? And at least in like multi-species studies, more than human anthropology, when we read this literature, we often get at least a loose sense that intimacy with other species requires co-presence, proximity, perhaps touch and multisensorial engagements to capture the ways in which, for example, affective and emotional dynamics between human and other species evolve. And I really don't disagree with this at all, but I do want to note a certain presentism in many of these discussions. And this is also part of what this paper or this chapter is trying to address. So if we think of what intimacy with a plant is, we also still have to maybe address the question briefly, what actually is a plant? And in biology, plant is a category for a vast diversity of beings. So you could think about mosses, algae, trees. So what unites these different beings, some of which you would see here on this big table, is their ability to harvest sunlight and practice photosynthesis. And though plants produce the oxygen in the atmosphere, they were also very long sidelined. And enable all of life, all animal life, they were very long sidelined, especially by the social sciences and the humanities. And even today in multi-species discussions, we still see much more focus on fungi or on animals than plants. And a reason for this might be that their movements are quite slow. Their reactions unfold over a very historically long period of time. And they seem much less charismatic, of course, than animals. So it's quite easy to overlook their roles as active participants in our social worlds. And even if they shape our lives from the food we eat, the clothing we wear, to the atmosphere we breathe in quite fundamental ways. But my thinking today is, of course, not, I wanted to briefly introduce what do we think about a plant, but it's not actually on plants in general, but it's about a specific plant, or that I'm trying to think with, and that is the Ugandan cooking banana, also called matuka. So this is the favorite staple crop in South Central Uganda. And this really is a crop that with its rhythms has shaped multi-species relationships and political organization there for hundreds of years. So historians think that with the onset of intensive banana cultivation there, and that was sometime between the 14th and the 17th century, that the banana was also able to sustain very high population densities in this part of the Great Lakes region. And so the story they narrate is that this enabled a highly centralized monarchy to emerge. It's also a monarchy that then invaded its neighbors and subdued many of them. So this is the history, how banana ties into a regional history here, how it's narrated. And if we think about bananas, they also have landscape effects, namely as a dense forest-like vegetation, And this is here, still if you go to Uganda along Lake Victoria, you will still see these vast banana plantations. They also created their own climates. They created shade and they retained moisture from Lake Victoria. So bananas here really did have these significant impacts and made contributions to kind of history, culture, and ecology in the Great Lakes region. And I mean, especially in what is today South Central Uganda. And actually the banana, so what is nice working about or thinking with the banana is that it's actually a quite strange plant. Now, when you look at the banana or what you saw, the pictures I've showed you, it really looks like a tree. But I think many of you will know that the stems are actually cut off when the fruits are harvested. So this is kind of what biologists call the pseudostem, or so they aren't perennial stems. And the real stem here for the banana is what you see under the ground. So it's an underground dry zone that continually develops new suckers. So this is kind of new plants that come up, these suckers here. These are new plants that then all will develop into new fruit-bearing stems. And in Uganda, people usually remove, so these suckers that come up you can remove those, and if it's a nice sucker, you would just go and you replant it elsewhere in the field, or you could use it as mulch. But without the uses of biotech, this is actually the only way in which you can propagate the plant, because it's also a plant that has been under cultivation for hundreds of years. And hundreds of years of breeding also mean that this plant has become sterile. It contains no seed. That's just about the biology of this, and this has much, I will come back to this later. And in Uganda, the banana plant is also quite rich in meanings. I will also mention some further meanings later, but in former days, it was also always said that it would kind of connect or maintain connections to the spirit worlds. So this would be to ancestor spirit or to what was called in Uganda spiritual twins. Bananas were also extremely capacious. They were not only the epitome of fertility, but they also were able to ward off certain types of luck, bad luck, some types of them, or they could even attract good fortune to you if you planted the right varieties. So suffice to say, this is a quite charismatic plant, extremely important in Uganda, and it's really a plant that has written itself into everyday life, into language. I haven't explored this, but it's completely full of idioms of agricultural labor and tending to bananas, landscape, and climate. And I could say a lot more about banana gardens and plots in Uganda, but I actually wanted to take you today into a little bit of an unconventional plot or a special type of plot, namely scientific places where plants are grown. So these are labs, greenhouses, and trial fields. And for me, thinking from these places is also quite interesting because here we encounter both a scientific ethos of how to engage these plants correctly, professionally, and at the same time, everyday plant care in Uganda is, of course, very much informed by these centuries of intensive banana cultivation and the familiarity that people have with these plants. And just quickly, the scientific project with which I worked aims at introducing transgenic, micronutrient-enriched bananas to Uganda and to East Africa. Some of you might be familiar with golden rice. So this is basically the same thing. It's the golden banana here. So it's the idea that you transform the DNA of this plant so that it accumulates more beta-carotene. And beta-carotene is a substance that when you eat it, your body can convert into vitamin A. And if you look closely, so these are some of the bananas from their trial fields here, you will see a little bit of yellow here. So this is already the golden, the high beta-carotene, part of this public health strategy against micronutrient deficiency in Uganda. And funding here comes from the Gate Foundation, and it's a research project how African science is often financed. It's like an Australian university receives the funding, and then the Ugandan partner in this. So we have an Australian PI, and then, but most of my time I spent really on the Ugandan side of the project. And what is important is that this project is carried out by molecular biologists. So these are the two PIs, the Australian, and this is the Ugandan, not called PI, but technical leader. So these are molecular biologists. That means most of their work actually consists in following quite, I would say even boring, but kind of strict, repetitive lab routines. So it's really a standardized protocol that you have to do over and over for hundreds of samples. So lots of time just spending in the lab and kind of doing the same thing over and over. But though this is a lab-based scientific project, they also actually have to see, can we actually produce these bananas as a public health intervention? This does require actually producing plants that people can then grow. So the project does involve all of these stages of actually, so this is kind of the normal thing, but all of these sites where intimacy or and people encounter plants, care for them, and actually have to grow them in their fields. And during my research, I just noticed that interesting things happened when researchers handled these plants. And now thinking more general, this is how I actually became interested in plant studies and what plant studies actually have to say. And plant studies quite often highlight closeness, love, and affection that emerges when people take care of plants. And there are even arguments for how we have to take human expressions of love for plants more seriously. Maybe some of you also know Julie Archambault's article regarding relationships between gardeners and their plants in Mozambique. And this is quite often a lovely storytelling, and one can really get a sense of there being some kind of love story between humans and plants. And I think a little bit of that is also here in my story. I can't entirely avoid it, but I'm also trying to say there's no need to romanticize, of course, this human-plant relationship. There is also much friction about such intimacies and the types of codependency that emerge. But now let us focus on some of these concrete plots that I was talking about. So for me, a pleasant break, and I think for the Ugandan biologists, it was also pleasant from lab routines, happened when research assistants had to work on plants. And I want to talk now about a specific type of plant work that is called weaning. Now, in botany and gardening, people speak often of a plant nursery, but I had never actually heard of the term weaning itself in connection with plants. So I signed up for this task to assist in weaning. And it was quite interesting that before I even started weaning, I had a postdoc who saw my name on the list, and then he said, he took me over and he said, Sandra, you really have to be careful. You'll see, these are still babies. You can't be rough. So I will say that in the scientific setting, I was initially a little bit surprised to hear this talk of plant babies, of nurseries, and especially of weaning plants. And I was also wondering why researchers use these metaphors that are so heavily connected to female reproduction, in particular childbearing and nursing. And of course, Ugandans really love children. That could be one simple explanation. I mean, it remains a country with one of the highest fertility rates. So when you talk about babies or children, it often is really positively or something very positive to talk about. But I just want to say there's a little bit more to this story than that. So to learn about weaning, I meet Faith, a research assistant in charge of weaning, shortly before 8 a.m. in the lab. And she takes a box of fresh gloves from the lab, a list of labels she just printed, and off we go. We head to the greenhouse. And there in the shade under a metal roof, we see Patience, another research assistant already waiting for us. And in front of Patience, we see several racks with about 25 small plants, each in glass tubes, which she retrieved from the growth rooms in the tissue culture lab. She also prepared some soil, paper, pens, cling film, and other instruments. So once we reach the prepared weaning station, Faith, the one in charge of weaning, inspects the plants in the glass tubes. And then she notices that 6 have already turned black and died. She says, these babies have overstayed and should have been weaned long ago. And she shakes her head in disapproval, directed at her negligent predecessor, who she later says simply abandoned the babies. And then Faith got to work. She put on her latex gloves and reaches to extract a plant from the tube. But then she stops and strips off the gloves again, and with her bare fingers gently pulls the young plant from the tube. So Faith then says she's afraid of breaking the stem with the gloves. It's too small. So these are safety protocols. They actually should wear the gloves because they were growing these plants in chemicals. So she puts the small plant onto a tray with water, washes its roots, then picks up the young plant again and holds it in one hand. She uses a tweezer to remove wilted roots and small leaves quite carefully. Cleaned and fresh, she puts the plant baby into a cup with soil that patient prepared. Patient sticks some more soil on top and also quite gently presses it down, careful not to break off new leaves or roots. So not having the expertise to handle banana plants, as ever so often I was tasked with labeling, making sure that the scientific numbers on the tubes match the ones on the pots, and then putting them on a small tray. So here they didn't trust me with the plants yet. But weaning here means putting banana plants that were generated in the lab and grown in tubes on nutrient media into soil for the first time. And a master's student called Esther told me that weaning means taking these young plants from the cozy, moisture and temperature controlled lab and making them feed themselves. They're weaned because in the lab, they were constantly observed, handpicked, and she said, fed with nutrient media like babies on a mother's milk. So we have more of this same type of language. And after weaning, the plants then are placed in the greenhouse to allow them to grow themselves and, as they say, harden. And quite similarly, on another day, I was in the greenhouse accompanying a scientist as he was preparing potted plants for planting them actually in the extension field trial, and that their plants were a bit mixed up. They weren't in the sequence of their numbers, and it took him a quite long time to find and choose the best plants for planting. And he then wanted to move this batch that we had selected into another greenhouse, but there are a lot of other plants. And then here again, he is the scientist technically in charge of the project, but here the greenhouse manager was a woman. She intervened and she flatly refused. And she said, it's not safe for the babies there. And then she just pointed out that there were different plants and that different types of disease, and she was worried for the health of the babies. So what I find quite significant was just how I just shared these scenes with how widespread this talk of plant babies, how present it was. But not everyone agreed with this greenhouse manager. And one senior researcher even told me that bananas are not babies. And he wanted to criticize all the fuss about plant babies that he witnessed. And this researcher's view that bananas are bananas, they are hard and strong and they will grow anywhere. And so this is also a Ugandan idea of this crop as a crop that is really hard to remove. If you once had a garden with bananas, some part of the rhizome will always be there and they will always keep coming up. And yet in any conventional banana plantation that you would go to today, people would also talk in the kind of the same way. So here they would talk about the mother plant, and they would say that the suckers that come up are the children, again, these ones that come up from below. And scientists and agronomists at this Ugandan Research Institute even speak of grandmothers. So in this case, the one having the bunch would be the grandmother. And then you would have the mother, this is the taller one, and then you would have the children or the daughters or growing up there. So this is a way of calling these differently aged suckers. And then they typically compare, okay, which generation is more productive? And in one case, a much younger sucker, that was called a daughter, produced a bunch of bananas before the older sucker, which was called the mother. And an agronomist explained this delay, and he said that here it was obvious that the mothers, because they had gone through the lab procedure, they had suffered for their daughters. They went through the stresses of lab testing, sample taking, weaning, repotting, and then he said, the daughters, they're just free to grow in the field. And I asked another researcher about this gendering of the plant, because biologically, these are biologists, they know the biology of this plant, of course, very well. The banana is neither male nor female, but contains both male and female parts. So this is what these Ugandan biologists also were happy to explain to me. But she said that because of the reproductive cycle, the fruiting and the flowering, the plants were considered mothers. And then she paused and she looked at me and she said, and because of their suffering for their offspring. And I really also like this explanation because it mirrors very common understanding, again, about motherhood in Uganda, and kind of this idea that mothers would always make loving and selfless sacrifices for their offspring. And another explanation for why young plants and suckers are thought as babies or children is that the plant today is, of course, considered the epitome of fertility and growth. It conventionally was grown by women, and in subsistence settings today still largely is grown by men. And the banana is, again, I said already, related to female reproductive processes. I can say more about that later, but one example was that formerly when babies were born, then the placenta was always used and was put on the rootstock of the banana plants. And there was an idea that the banana maintained a spiritual connection to the child. So it was always very important who would then eat that fruiting bunch. Or barren women would tie a banana flower to their backs. So this was something till in the 1970s was still a documented practice. Or from the ethnographic record, we know there was such a thing as a ghost pregnancy. So bananas were able to impregnate women. When women dug there and a banana flower, the tip of it touched their backs, there could have been such a thing as a ghost pregnancy. Again, just to say, there was a really rich historical and cultural archive on this plant. Now, the question, of course, is when faith touched the young plants and weaned them off the nutrient media, were such long histories of engaging with plants really at her fingertips, right? This was one of the questions I was thinking about. Of course, to some extent, I would have to speculate. But what we do know for sure here is that scientists feel for these plants and treat them quite tenderly and caringly. And they mobilize vocabularies and also culturally coded vocabularies of nurturance and childcare, indexing very intimate relationships that are associated with female practices of caretaking. And of course, to some extent, we can say, yes, people who work with plants elsewhere, scientists, breeders, gardeners, farmers, they also feel for their plants. And we know they also conceive of them caringly, often as babies or children. I don't know, the anthropologists among you might have known the trope of the so-called crop children. So this is what we know in many different contexts, Amazonia, also many Asian contexts, where people kind of make connections between their main agricultural crops and their growth cycles and the cycles of their own children. So maybe nothing out of the ordinary, maybe to some extent expected when people spend much time with plants. So if we reflect on this encounter between faith here and the plant babies, we can say that, of course, here, physical proximity, direct contact with bodily substances, touch, smell, vision, of course, produce an impression and an encounter, a specific situation, something unfolded here between a plant's materiality and faith herself. But still, what actually unfolded here when she held this brittle plantling between her fingers moved her to remove these gloves. But how she thought about and touched these young plants can't really be reduced to that moment, because she already thought of them as plant babies. And like most scientists at this institute, she does really have a robust understanding of growing these plants in her family garden too. It was further probably also not lost on faith that mainly women were assigned to the task of weaning in this lab. So certain forms of labor are just female labor, or coded as that. That's not what I say. It's certain forms of practice that I'm referring to. So thinking about plants as babies outruns the moment and what one is able to feel and register it. So here is a bit this argument against the presentist understanding of affect, which is present in some strands of multi-species discussion. So here, I think it's attending to these dynamics between faith and her experimental plants rather points at these routines of proximity. And I think it is a way for us to also get in touch with particular histories of banana cultivation and histories that run quite deep. But we can say, yes, being intimate with a plant involved it's kind of dexterity, touching, knowing a plant's needs, taking care of it, having appropriate touch, tenderness, an ability to feel for the organism, as Evelyn Fox Keller put it. But there are also other modes or other things involved with knowing someone intimately. And I don't know if any of you knows this beautiful book by Pareñas, writing on Borneo on called Decolonizing Extinction. So it's a case about orangutans. And it's also about what is this kind of intimacy actually involved. And she argues that it also involves really being intimate with another being, involves attending to their temporalities and rhythms. And here I want to just highlight of some of the unwanted dynamics that can also result from attending, or the inconveniences that can come from attending to another's rhythms. Yeah, the banana is much more capricious than other crops, especially like in my own discipline, anthropology, that we know. For much has been written about yam or about rice. But you could also add wheat or sorghum, like different crops that have seasonal harvest times. They seem to be alike. And the banana is different from those because it randomly fruits throughout the year. So people would say it requires not like masses of, like, it doesn't have a fixed harvest time where everyone gets together and collectively works, but it requires light but steady care. And this patterns a lot of everyday life and mobility in many rural areas of South Central Uganda still today. Banana plants, it's kind of a plot you have to stay rather close by. You need to know when it's ripe, you have to harvest it before your neighbors do, and so forth. And the banana also has a specific rhythm that shapes human-plant relationships at this institute. And one, not only at this institute in general, but at this institute it's felt quite strongly. So one plant-specific rhythm is called, it has a really boring name, but it's actually quite interesting, it's called the bunch cycle time. So that is the time that elapses between planting and being able to harvest a bunch. So depending on banana variety, the bunch cycle time can be anywhere between 9 and 18 months. So formerly in Uganda, to get married, you had to have a plot of land to kind of start your own banana plantation, otherwise you couldn't get married. And so the first year until when you planted, until the first bunches would ripen, that was always a vulnerable time for new couples because they still depended on broader kin and patronage relationships to feed themselves. But even today, the bunch cycle time is still a really crucial metric in how farmers, but also agronomists assess banana plants. So small farmers who depend on occasional incomes from bananas, they prefer the quickly maturing kinds that take 10 to 12 months. Instead of the varieties that need 18 months, but produce bigger bunches. We can just kind of imagine, right? If you're a small farmer, you need the steady income. You don't want to wait a long time till these bunches are ripe. But once the plantation is growing, you can shorten the bunch cycle time through proper planting. And here we come back again. Ideally, you leave the proper planting is always considered. Ideally, you leave these 3 suckers at different heights. So you always have one fruit that is near to fruiting. So I already showed that schematically. It's a little bit, I know you can actually see it here. So here we have a grandmother, to stick with that language, here the mother, and here we have the daughter and the child. Yeah, and this same spacing is also used, by the way, in industrial banana plantations around the globe. And this bunch cycle time is always specific to banana variety. So this variety-based rhythm organizes labor relations and intimacies between people and plants. How so? Well, first, a note on the Ugandan Australian research team that is working on these genetically modified bananas. They think a lot about time and about speed, and they believe that their technologies are they're fast-paced, high-tech. This is what we need. We can't breed bananas, or it's extremely difficult to breed them. And they also think that the technologies they develop will have the broadest application for public health and making bananas disease-resistant, more nutritious, drought-resistant, all sorts of things. And why is this important? It is important because the banana internationally is considered a crop on the verge of extinction. So these scientists understand themselves as being in a race against time. But still, they have been working on this one type of banana, namely the micronutrient enriched banana, since 2005, and it's still not done. And just let me say, in molecular biology, even this is an unusually long time in a really fast-paced lab science normally. So again here, what is the reason for this? And here, of course, the bunch cycle time, we have to come to the, it is actually due to this, we're not quite there yet, due to this bunch cycle time that people talk about the banana, or they talked about the banana and said, the scientists said, the banana is stubborn, it's lengthy and tedious. It's like, if you had to work with them, Sandra, you know. So bananas, after all, take around 10 months to mature, and this is only the fast maturing varieties. And then scientists have to test several generations of these bananas. And then sometimes they realize this is not working, we have to redo the science, and then you start again. So while admittedly Ugandan biologists were also somewhat glad that they had these long-term jobs in science, they also suffered somewhat from few publications. And like their Australian colleagues, said that the banana had ruined their career prospects. And really many aired their frustration about this. And while I was in Uganda, the team had many problems, for example, generating plans for the field trial. And then Faith, whom I already introduced above, she said, oh, they just failed to cooperate. They delayed the project and they caused a lot of frustration. And at that point, anxiety, because you need to produce results to get the next funding cycle. I think you all know what the games of science are like. And Esther was a master's student who had planned to write her thesis about Nachimika. This was the plant variety that scientists said was misbehaving. And she was really angry because her topic had just evaporated and she had no money for another semester at Makerere University. But there really was nothing to be done. Nachimika refused, and then scientists had to switch to less fussy banana variety. And here then they replanted it with Nachitembe, which is also this is the lucky one. This is the one that attracts luck. So it's a very culturally, very specific banana variety, and people love it very much. And that was the one that was also receptive to biotechnological transformation. But established scientists mentioned quite similar frustrations related to working closely with bananas. And this was when I was for 2 months on the Australian side of the project. One postdoc there mentioned, who also works in this project, told me that in 8 years, he had only 4 publications. And he was actually the one who introduced me to the idea of the banana as a career breaker. And then he compared himself to his colleague, who in the same time had completed several projects and had published 27 papers in the same 8 years. And a senior researcher in Australia confirmed that the banana can be a career breaker for the Australian Ugandan research team. And he said, the thing is, you can use a model crop that matures in 3 weeks, then you have your results, run them through, boom, throw them out, get published. I do really feel for younger researchers that work in the banana. It's difficult. If you transform bananas, then grow them, wait for them to mature, harvest and analyze them, you will minimally spend years. Most jobs don't even last that long. And the understanding of time here is based very much on the model organism in plant molecular biology, and that's a common weed called Arabidopsis. So it can produce offspring in a few weeks, and that's just kind of very much in line with the tempos of high-paced science. So normally, you just develop a technology, you test it in Arabidopsis, and you don't care about actually what does the product look like? Do I actually grow it in the field? You just publish a paper, proof of concept, boom, you're out and you've done it, and everyone cites your paper, and it works out for researchers that way. But here, science, molecular biology, where it had a specific challenge, namely trying to create these bananas, was unable to really master the banana's difficult biology. So rather, what we saw here was that these scientists working intimately with their plants have to adapt themselves to the plants. Their careers follow plant rhythms, and remaining in sync with the plant here comes at a high price. So by attuning themselves to these plants, these scientists become what Natasha Myers, writing on other biologists, has called vegetalized or plantified. So she meant you really follow the rhythms of the plants themselves. But becoming vegetalized in this way, becoming slow as a plant, is something that, of course, these scientists here resent in this quickly moving field. So for Myers, it was more something positive, that scientists become vegetalized, they become able to appreciate plants particularity. What I want to say is that affection for bananas at one moment doesn't preclude resentment and frustration about them at another moment. So rather, intimacy here with plants can be as troubling, dissatisfying, and problematic as other intimate relationships can be. So just to draw some of these threads together. Now, I immersed you in a very particular kind of plot and a particular kind of relationship that unfolded there. And I explored these relationships of plant scientists to their experimental plants by asking what exactly is at their fingertips when they touch banana plants. And to kind of try to answer this question, I selected ethnographic material that speaks of different temporal horizons of intimacy. So one scene here detailed the labors of weaning, during which scientists treat newly grown experimental plants with great tenderness, care, and parental concern. And the other gave voice to experiences with these plants over a longer period of time, kind of what it means to be a banana scientist, and how this mutual conditioning of plant and scientists often is not welcome at all. So taken together, this kind of material to some extent expands discussions in multi-species studies focused mainly on affective dynamics in the moment of encounter and situations of co-presence and proximity. So bodily responses to vegetative beings, of course, matter, but they too have histories. Hands just don't move spontaneously in an encounter, but they already knew how to handle these plants, and they were also skilled in line with scientific conventions. And scientists here, that when they were assigned to such tasks as weaning, of course, they built on their knowledge of banana reproduction. They knew the difficulties the projects had faced in growing them, and they also knew about the fragility of these experimental plants. So through this quotidian work with plants, the scientists build expertise and at times careers or not. That is still a big question up in the air around this capricious crop. And they develop, they develop a very specific expertise. And moreover, this all is only able, this kind of really intimate knowledge of in a historical and cultural setting where the banana already is this highly beloved and ubiquitously grown food crop, and where this extremely rich archive of banana knowledge exists. And this is again to reiterate this point that all Ugandan scientists I interacted with, even those that were not from regions where this food crop was traditionally grown, they all had a familiarity with the common techniques and know how to cultivate these plants. It's really, everyone has bananas in their backyards. So examining ways of feeling and dealing with these plants, whether they are babies or career breakers, also offers some insights into the particularities of scientific practices and how such long paths of living intimately with banana plants also make themselves felt in the present. And I think unlike these human-centered histories that record memorable events and often memorable men, the suggestion here is to understand plant intimacy as a partially embodied archive that, when we attend to it, can also tune us to very long-standing experiences and histories. But maybe it's better at capturing those histories that are more felt on one's fingertips, or in how we touch or engage our bodily responses to the atmospheres of places than it is explicitly enunciated. But it also, all of this allows us to think about plants in a more capacious way. So taking seriously these more than human forms of intimacy invites us to see non-humans like plants as active participants in social life, as beings that can affect us, and of course, not only by stirring tender emotions. Plants are also quite active participants in these careers, as I showed you, as scientists interpreted them as career breakers. And I think we encountered here plants that are cared for, patronized, treated as precious and vulnerable, but were also at other moments stubbornly refusing to collaborate with scientists, growing at their own paces, pursuing their own projects in the world. So while banana plants are capacious historical agents and have long written themselves into Great Lakes landscapes in history, they're also sterile and cannot reproduce on their own. So in many ways, their fate today is entwined with that of plant science. So I think this thinking about what is on the fingertips of scientists really provides a window into narrating not only the work-related involvement with plants of these scientists, but also histories of an intimate imbrication of human and banana plants in this part of the world. Kind of the roads they have already traveled together, where kind of neither could thrive without the other. Neither banana could thrive without humans, nor humans without the banana. And why does this matter? I just think that at this moment in Earth history, where damage, violence, and inequality abound, thinking from concrete plots and the more than human intimacies they entail remains quite important to me. I think relationships to plants are increasingly fraught, and many plants today are threatened by rapidly changing climates, industrial agriculture, traveling pests and diseases, and obviously the Ugandan banana is threatened among them. So thinking with intimacies that emerge when humans cultivate plants and are cultivated by them remains us to some extent as stay with the trouble, as Dunaway Haraway said it. So not shifting the burden of how we want to live and cultivate less environmentally harmful ways into discussions about the future. Rather, as also Sylvia Winter reminded us, it's in the here and now. In the plots are actual places of plant intimacy, including the gardens and the labs, the farms and plantations, that common futures are grown, and that both materially and conceptually. And that is what I wanted to share with you. So thanks so much for your attention.